Hi, this is Jeremy Jansen, and I'd like to welcome you to the June 2010 issue of Reason Wizardry. This month we're going to be taking an in-depth look at the Thor step sequencer. I've had some customer requests to check this out at some point in Reason Wizardry, so I decided this month is as good a time as any. This is a very complex and large area talking about the Thor step sequencer. We're not going to be able to get into every possible use for it, but hopefully there's going to be enough different and useful tips here that you can get started with some new advanced Thor step sequencer patches. So we're going to start out by looking at the basics of the Thor step sequencer. This will probably be refresher material for many of you, but it's an important foundation before we continue on. I've programmed a basic Thor bell patch as well as a simple sequence in the step sequencer. So with everything else set up at default, we'll just hear how it sounds. Nothing too special there, but for demonstration purposes, it should do fine. So that's repeat mode. Once we trigger the step sequencer, it will keep playing until it receives another trigger or stop. So then there's one-shot mode, which just plays through the sequence once. There's step mode, which for each trigger the Thor step sequencer receives, it'll just move one step in its sequence. And that doesn't seem very useful right now, but I'll show you some interesting uses for it later. Okay, there's also the different directions, and we've been using forward. There's reverse as well. There's pendulum, 1 and 2. And the difference here is that pendulum 1 actually repeats step 1 and step 16 at the start and end. So they play twice, whereas pendulum 2, they just play once like every other step. And then random, of course. Okay, so now moving on to the different modulation parameters that we can enter into the step sequencer. We've got the note value, of course, and that's set up either to 4 or the complete set of notes, 2 or 4 octaves rather, or the complete set of notes. There's velocity for each note. There's gate length, which is a really nice feature. I'll turn down the release of the pattern here just to demonstrate it. So you can use it to enter staccato notes, or you can use it to tie 2 notes together if you're using a monophonic sequence. There's also step duration, which lets you increase or decrease the duration of each individual step. So I can increase the duration of step 1, or decrease it. And then we've got our 2 assignable curve values that we need to set up to modulate something using the mod matrix. So by themselves, they don't do anything. You need to set up, say, curve 1 going to oscillator 1 position or something like that, or a filter frequency. All right, just about finished here. Obviously, it's a 16-step sequencer, and we can select how many steps we'd like by just clicking the last step, or you can use the rotary here to dial in the number of steps that you'd like. All right, that finishes off the basic look at the Thor step sequencer. Next, we're going to look at the differences between sequencing something with a matrix pattern sequencer and the Thor step sequencer. So what I've done is programmed the same sequence we already heard into this matrix pattern sequencer. Okay, so there are some inherent advantages of the matrix, and one of them is very obvious, that it's 32 steps instead of the 16 steps here in the Thor step sequencer. And of course, it's able to store 64 different patterns, whereas there's only one pattern that we can easily use with a Thor step sequencer. So that's pretty huge, depending on what your needs are. If you need more than one sequence easily, you're going to want to use the matrix just about every time. Now, beyond that, there's also the shuffle control that you've got on the matrix that doesn't exist on the Thor step sequencer, so that's another advantage. And then the final advantage, or maybe it's just a difference, is that the matrix pattern sequencer plays in step with the Reason main sequencer. So when you push run on it, it's never going to be out of time with the main sequencer. Whereas when you push run on the Thor step sequencer, if you're not exactly on the beat, whenever you trigger the Thor step sequencer, that's exactly when it will start. So you can run into some problems with your sequence not starting exactly in sync with the rest of your song. So that can be a plus or minus depending on what you want. Now, for some of the advantages of the Thor step sequencer, there's quite a few. First, of course, there's many more parameters that you can adjust for each note. There isn't anything like gate length, step duration on the matrix. And the matrix does have a curve that you can assign to any CV parameter that you like, but the step sequencer in Thor has two different curves. And then there's the variety of different playback modes that are offered in the step sequencer, and nothing like that is available in the matrix. In practice, one of the main advantages of using the Thor step sequencer is that it's very easy to trigger it from a MIDI note. The matrix isn't that simple to almost use it like arpeggiator. Basically, you need to trigger its run button somehow, but you can't play a MIDI note and easily transpose that up and down the keyboard. I'll demonstrate with this technique that many of you will be aware of. So what we'll have here is MIDI key gate triggering the step sequencer, and MIDI key note transposing the step sequencer. So now when I play a MIDI note, say C2 or E2, so it's more set up for live playback and kind of transposed sequences triggered from your keyboard. That's not really a strong suit of matrix. It is possible to control a Thor that way from a matrix, but it's not really ideal. So that covers the major differences of the Thor step sequencer and the matrix pattern sequencer. Okay, now we're going to proceed to the advanced uses of the Thor step sequencer. What I've got here is the same patch that we were working with before, and I've duplicated it. I've ran both patches through a mixer and slightly detuned them. So the result is just exactly what you'd expect. So now we're going to get started with a step sequencer here, and we're going to use it in step mode, which is something a little bit different than you may have done before. So first, shortening it to 2 steps. Do that on both. All right, and now we're going to have the first Thor trigger on the first step, and the second Thor trigger on the second step. And now you can see they're on opposite steps, so one should be silent when the other one is playing. So we're not going to be able to hear that very easily unless we separate them somehow. So let's pan them hard left and hard right. Finally, we're going to need to turn off the MIDI trigger for each Thor, because we don't want to trigger notes from our keyboard. We want our keyboard to trigger the step sequencer, which will in turn trigger a note. So let's see if this is working now. So I can't quite get both sequencers on the screen here at the same time, but they are playing on opposite steps, and it's just a 2-note sequence, so they're going back and forth. That's what it sounds like, and that effect I find really useful, and it's difficult to duplicate in another way. It's not just an automated pan going side to side, it's actually a different synth voice for each side. If we were just automating the pan, we wouldn't hear each note decay separately like we do here. Those are 2 different synth voices. So this is just the beginning of what you can do using multiple Thors, setting their step sequencer to step mode, and changing something about each Thor. So we're going to continue on and try something else in that same vein coming next. We're now going to begin expanding on the concepts from the last chapter. So we've got the exact same patch here, and we're going to do a type of wave sequencing instead of this side-to-side panning. So to do that, let's duplicate this patch 2 more times. So we've got a total of 4 Thors, and we'll just get their audio into the mixer. We'll change all the panning back to the center. And now let's open up the first Thor, and what we're going to do is lengthen the sequence to 4 steps on the second one as well. The third one, and on the third one, as you can probably imagine, we're going to activate the third step. And on the fourth Thor, activate the 4th step. It's important to ensure that they're all lined up in the right spot of the sequence. This light over this step means that this sequence is on the first step. So it's important that every one is on the first step. This one is on the second step. So we need to sync them up. And how we can do that is just push run once until we've got it started on the second step. So now they're all on step 2. Okay, so now we've got identical patches playing one at a time on 4 different steps. Now we're going to change the patches slightly, kind of to get a pseudo wavesequencer type sound. So for the second one, instead of bell, let's try voice. On the third one, let's try square harmonics. And on the final Thor, let's try organ. Okay. So now if we play one note 4 times, we should hear 4 different sounds. The square harmonics, I think, are a little bit overdone. See if I can tone that down a bit. I thought there's a little bit of a tuning issue. Our 4th note is tuned to a different note, so we need everything tuned to C3. Okay, let's try that again. And now we're no longer in sync again. We're on the first active step there, and we're on the 4th there. When you're editing multiple sequences like this, that's common. So all we need to do is change the 4th Thor to be on the 4th step, and we should be good. So that's Pseudo Wavesequencer created using the Thor step sequencer. You can take that again another level up and perhaps have different pan settings for each different sound. So when you play notes, not only is it a different sound, but they're panning across the stereo spectrum. Something like that, perhaps. I've pulled up an arpeggiate here just on the same patch we are working with, just to hear what it sounds like playing through a wave sequenced patch like this. So let's give it a listen. So that's not a very common sound that you hear in Reason, and you wouldn't think that it's created using the step sequencer. But that's one of the many advanced uses that the step sequencer is perfect for. One important thing to remember about the step sequencer is not only is it useful for triggering the Thor that it resides inside, but it's also useful for triggering and modulating other devices in the Reason rack. So in this case, what I've done is added a NN19 that corresponds to each of the 4 Thors from the previous chapter. And they're loaded with different percussion type sounds. We've got a vibraphone, log drum, Rhodes electric piano, and a xylophone. So instead of the Thor triggering its own sound, each one of them is rigged up to trigger the NN19 below it. So you're not limited to using this technique just for, the built-in Thor oscillators. So let's hear how it sounds. So I've done the same panning technique as before. The first 4 channels here were our Thor channels that I just turned down to nothing. If we brought them back in, then we'd hear the Thor songs mixed in, the Thor sounds mixed in with NN19 sounds. As well, the only other thing you'll have to remember when you try something like this is you need to go into the combinator controls and turn off receive notes for each of the NN19s, because we don't want them to receive MIDI. We want our MIDI to go to the Thor step sequencer, which then triggers the NN19. You'll get double notes if you don't turn off the receive notes on each one of the NN19s. Also, you should be aware of the major limitation of this technique is that it doesn't handle chords or polyphonic notes at all, really. I've just been playing monophonic lines to demonstrate it, and that's because it can't play chords. I'm trying to play 2 notes right there, and it just doesn't happen. And that's because CV signals in Reason are inherently monophonic, except for in one specific exceptional case. So it isn't possible to send 2 different notes from the Thor step sequencer out to the NN19, or from the Thor step sequencer to itself. It's just not built that way, and I wish it was, but you're going to have to be limited to monophonic notes when you use this technique. We're going to now move in a bit of a different direction with the step sequencer. I've programmed a step sequenced patch here, a bit of a bass line. I'll play it for you. So I've already got it set up to play from a MIDI keyboard and transpose to what MIDI note you play with these first 2 mod matrix entries. I've already spoken about that. So beyond that, what we're going to talk about now is what if you wanted to have 2 Thor step sequencer sequences. We already mentioned that there's only one sequence. It's not like a matrix that can store 64, but there's the odd time when you just could use an extra one, just 2. And I'm going to show you how to do that, and it's actually not as complex as you'd think. If you want to go more than 2, we're not going to head all the way in that direction because that gets fairly complex. But you can kind of extend this with your imagination and continue on if you did want to add many more Thor sequences. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is duplicate the Thor patch, and I've already done that. So this is a duplicated patch, and I've programmed a slightly different sequence in it. So its audio output is not being sent anywhere. Instead, what we're going to do is use its step sequencer outputs and connect that up to the first Thor's sequencer control. Now we've got them connected up, but how are we going to switch between the two sequences? To do that, we're going to have to use a combinator control. I've already labeled it here. It's button 1. So let's go into our combinator programmer, and we're going to have to make an entry for both Thors. And for the first Thor, we're going to say note trigger step seek 1 to 0. And so what that means is we're automating this button right here. So when we push the combinator button, which will be wanting to switch to sequence B, it will turn off the trigger for its own step sequencer. That means it's going to ignore what its own step sequencer is outputting. So essentially we're disabling its step sequencer, just like that. Okay, so that disables its own sequence. Now we need to activate the second Thor's step sequence. So to do that, we've got to scroll way down and find step sequencer run mode. And we're going to want that to be, I believe, 0 to 3. So what that's going to do is automate this right here. So it's going to automate between repeat mode and off. So let's give that a try. We should first hear sequence A. And now if I click this, sequence B. That is sequence B. It's not that different. Why don't I change something a little bit extra here? Well, what if we just reversed the sequence? So now we've got our first sequence. And a reversed second sequence. All right, so that's how you can add a second sequence to the Thor step sequencer. And if you wanted to continue on and add 4 or more sequences, go for it. We're going to end it here though. So hopefully by now you're starting to get some ideas for new ways you can use the Thor step sequencer in your music. Here is another new way, and something you may not have thought of already. It's use of the one-shot mode. And first I'll just switch to repeat, and you can hear this simple Thor patch and sequence that I created. Okay, now we'll switch to one-shot mode. So basically I got this idea from Ableton Live. The pads that you can use to basically fire off a phrase, be that a MIDI loop or an audio loop, just with one click. And if you push it repeatedly, it'll start over again from the beginning of the phrase. So I've tried to duplicate that in one button, and that's useful from a performance standpoint. Of course, you can use it live, or you could use it in a complex combinator when you have an additional element that you don't necessarily want to be controlled with a MIDI keyboard. Instead, you can just fire that phrase, whether it's a percussion or something like this, a short melodic phrase, you can fire it off using a single button. So I'm not starting this patch from scratch because it's a little bit difficult to get your head around. I'm going to just explain it from its finished state. So first let's watch it in action here. So the main element is that whether we're pushing this button on or off, it's still triggering the phrase. Okay, so how do we accomplish that? We start out by mapping the Thor button 1 and button 2 to the step sequencer trigger. So that means by pushing button 1 or button 2, we're going to trigger that step sequence in one-shot mode. And then we go into the combinator programmer, and you can see for button 1, when one-shot trigger is off, that's actually triggering button 1 on our Thor. And when one-shot trigger is on, that's triggering button 2. Now you can visualize that if you look at these buttons while I push the combinator button. So whether it's on or off, it's still triggering the one-shot. Now the rotaries also tie into it, and I'll talk about how now. The problem that you have if you don't have the rotaries mapped, I'll turn these off. Is that by pushing the one shot, nothing will happen. Because if you look at the mod matrix, when button 1 is off, button 2 is on. And so they actually cancel each other out. So you get a net neutral signal. So we need to scale them at the same time so that we don't actually ever get an off signal. So now I'm going to pull back up those rotary mappings here. Okay, so it's easy to visualize if you watch this. So in this case, button 2 is on and rotary 2 is opened up to let that signal through. Button 1 is off and rotary 1 is closing off that signal so that the off signal doesn't negate button 2. So they all work together so that something that isn't really designed to function this way can fire off the same signal whether it's on or off. This is meant to be a toggle switch, not a pad that performs the same function with every button press, but in this way you can make it into a pad. Obviously, going beyond the application of this one-shot sequence, you can use this same philosophy for a whole variety of functions with Thor. In any case, when you want a combinator button to trigger something in Thor the same every time instead of on and off. I have one more patch for you here, looking at a completely different direction of Thor step sequencer usage, and this time it's going to be as an effect. So first, let's listen to this dry drum loop I've got prepared. Okay, so there's nothing fancy about this patch. It's very basic and easy to follow. We've got audio input 1 going to filter 1, audio input 2 going to filter 2, and then filter 1 going to the left side of filter 3, and filter 2 going to the right side of filter 3. So we're not going to actually use these filters for much. You may use them for something when you're expanding on this patch. Instead, what we're going to use is the triggering from the step sequencer. Since we're sending audio in to the first two filters, that means we actually need to trigger the envelopes before we can hear anything. This is unlike filter 3. You can send audio straight into filter 3 and you don't need to do anything with the envelopes. But in this case, you can actually get some really cool stuff by triggering the envelopes using the step sequencer. So here, if we play the step sequencer, we're not going to hear anything because we don't have anything set up yet. So let's put down some gate signals. So you can use a setup like this as a really simple stereo gate. And you can also control that stereo gate very easily using the amp envelope. So if I turn down release all the way, okay, so that's just getting started with it. Now we can continue on, and how about something like turning off the sync and trying a very fast sequence. Let's just put in something at random here. Turn the volume down because it can get rather loud. So you can almost get like a granular chopping up of the sound depending on the speed of the sequencer. So by automating the step sequencer speed, you can get some pretty interesting sounds. Actually, I began experimenting with this during Filter Research 1. I believe I have a patch in there called Gateable that takes something like this to a really professional next level. So if you have Filter Research 1, definitely check that out. So that's it for the June 2010 issue of Reason Wizardry. Thanks for being patient with the late release this month, and thank you as always for subscribing and supporting me. Hopefully next month I'll come back and may be able to talk about Reason 5. If not, I'm sure all of you are as excited about that as I am. So we're definitely going to have a lot of issues looking at Reason 5 in the future, if not next month. I hope everyone is having a great early start of summer so far. I'm Jeremy Jansen, and until next month, cheers.